Sold as wonders of the ancient world, the Aztec children were indigenous siblings who stunned 19th century crowds with their unique appearances and mysterious origins. But behind the velvet curtains and sideshow myths was a dark truth. These disabled children were no ancient wonders, but victims of exploitation, greed and deception. This is their story. Máximo and Bartola, known more famously as the Aztec Children, were indigenous siblings born in Central America, most probably in El Salvador, around the late 1830s. As you may have suspected, there is little credible information on their childhood, and there are many contradicting stories about where they came from and how they ended up becoming a sideshow. One such tale came from Pedro Velázquez, a writer who composed a work in 1851 with an extremely long title that you can now see on screen. In this, Velázquez stated that he'd been part of an expedition a few years earlier that had travelled into Mexico during the American-Mexican War of 1846 to 1848. During this, he claimed that they discovered an ancient city called Ishimaya. There, the group allegedly found two bizarre-looking children in a temple, said to be some of the last pure-blooded living descendants of the mighty Aztecs, the ancient rulers of Mexico before the Spanish conquest in the early 1520s. Smuggled back to the US, the mysterious duo soon hit the stage, and so began the sensational rise of Máximo and Bartola, the so-called Aztec Children. The only problem with this story is that it was completely and utterly made up. There wasn't even a Pedro Velázquez, the supposed author of the illustrated memoir. Yet, there was something undeniably unique about these siblings, who many believed may have been twins, though even that detail remains uncertain. What was clear from an early age, however, was that both children showed signs of significant physical and cognitive challenges. As a result, their parents were unable to care for them, and handed them over to a man named Raimundo Selva, who reportedly bought them for gold, and took them to his native Grenada in the Caribbean. But while there, Selva was arrested on unrelated charges, and custody of the children fell into the hands of a group of opportunists. Noticing their elongated faces, strange expressions, and confusion with the modern world, the group saw profit, not people. They didn't see two vulnerable children, they saw a spectacle. So they whisked them off to America, ready to parade them to the world. Another story claims that Selva promised the children's parents he would take them to America for treatment, seeing that they were clearly intellectually disabled. In this version of events, he did so, but once abroad, sold them to a Mr. Morris, who was involved in the so-called freak shows of the era. Whichever tale is true, one fact is certain. By the late 1840s, Máximo and Bartola were in the United States, no longer children in need, but commodities in the growing world of freak shows, which were exploding in popularity at the time. This appears to be the true story of their origins. In the US, Máximo and Bartola were given the surname Velázquez, but like much of their story, this too was a fabrication. It was borrowed from their fictional promoter, the made-up figure Pedro Velázquez, created to add mystique. In truth, their real parents are believed to have been Inocente Burgos and Marina Espina, and even their first names, Máximo and Bartola, were likely invented for the shows. Soon, they were being promoted across the US and Europe as the remarkable Aztec Children, supposedly the last descendants of a lost empire. Máximo and Bartola made their circus debut in the late 1840s, quickly becoming a sensation. By 1851, they had crossed the Atlantic to appear at London's Crystal Palace during the World's Fair, one of the grandest stages of the era. Just a year later, in 1852, Their success sparked a custody battle between their various guardians, with thousands of dollars changing hands to settle the dispute, a small fortune at the time. Their fame reached new heights in 1853 when they were granted an audience with US President Millard Fillmore. As the years passed, the legend of the remarkable Aztec children only grew, even as the truth of who they really were faded deeper into obscurity. So why did people believe Máximo and Bartola were some sort of exotic descendants of the ancient Aztecs? The answer is actually quite sad. Both siblings suffered from a severe form of microcephaly, a genetic condition that results in a smaller or misshapen skull. This caused significant cognitive impairment and gave them a strikingly unusual appearance, especially when combined with their peculiar hair. And this rare look became their curse. It gave their guardians, or more accurately, their owners, the idea to begin displaying them as the exotic survivors from an old and legendary empire. As anyone familiar with the circuses and freak shows of the 19th century knows, exploiting people who had genetic disorders and physical illnesses was the stock and trade of such shows. People with dwarfism and gigantism, as well as people with hertism and a range of other conditions, were common exhibits at these shows. This is the world the Aztec children had been thrust into, when they were no older than about 9 or 10 years old. From a modern perspective, it's hard to believe that anyone could be fooled into thinking two clearly intellectually disabled children were ancient descendants of a lost civilization. But there is an explanation behind how this bizarre myth took hold. The 19th century was an era in which the wider public in the Western world had a growing interest in non-Western cultures. This had started back in the 18th century, as the European powers like Britain and France had begun to conquer and colonize more and more faraway lands. For instance, the British had begun conquering India rapidly from the late 1750s onwards. During this time, the primary interest was in the study of the Middle East and India, with Egyptology, the study of ancient Egypt, becoming very popular following the French military expedition to the country in the late 1790s. By the 19th century, this interest in foreign cultures was expanding. It was also becoming fused with a greater interest in natural history and primitive societies, like those found in the Amazon, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Oceania. The interest in Máximo and Bartola should probably be viewed in this light. When people heard about the two Aztec children, they wanted to see what people descended from the ancient Aztec Empire looked like and how they acted. And the fact that they looked and acted so strangely only added to the mysteriousness surrounding them. Yet the bizarre truth is that if anyone wanted to see what an Aztec person really looked like, all they had to do was look for their descendants who were still around in Mexico. The Nahua people, descendants of the Aztecs, were never wiped out by the Spanish invasion. Despite devastating diseases like smallpox and measles ravaging their population, the Nahua survived, and they still thrive today. They are the largest indigenous group in Mexico, and about 1.5 million people still speak Nahuatl, the ancient language of the Aztecs, in modern Mexico. But instead of honouring this living legacy, Máximo and Bartola were paraded as the last survivors of an ancient empire, a tragic lie sold to the world for profit. As the years passed, Máximo and Bartola's fame only grew, drawing international attention. By 1853, they were touring Europe once again, becoming a sensation wherever they went. In London, they were even presented to Queen Victoria, who had met many such performers from sideshows during her reign. They were also examined by some natural scientists who, after studying them, declared there was no evidence to support the wild claims that the siblings were ancient Aztec descendants. Instead, they concluded the children were simply descended from both Spanish and Aztec ancestors, a far cry from the mythical Aztec Children story that had made them famous. Still, the myth endured, as the crowds continued to flock to see them. In 1860, Máximo and Bartola was sold to none other than P.T. Barnum, the most famous showman of the 19th century. They joined an unforgettable roster of oddities at Barnum's American Museum, touring alongside legends like Chang and M. Bunker, General Tom Thumb, and the Swedish Nightingale Jenny Lind. Under Barnum, Máximo and Bartola continued to be paraded as the Aztec Children, but as they grew older and their fame dwindled, Barnum resorted to extreme measures. The exploitation of Máximo and Bartola reached a disturbing climax in London at the start of 1867. By now, the label of children no longer held up. Both were fully grown adults, and the original gimmick was wearing thin. So, their handlers took a twisted new turn. They were rebranded as the Aztec Lilliputians, drawing on the tiny inhabitants of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels to keep their fantasy alive. But the most shocking stunt? They were married to each other. Whether they understood what was happening or had any say in the matter is unknown, but for their promoters, it was the ultimate publicity ploy, a bizarre union to revive the spectacle and sell a fresh round of tickets. This brazen publicity stunt, a desperate attempt to squeeze the last drops of profit from Máximo and Bartola's fading fame, was justified with the absurd claim that the ancient Aztecs had practiced incestuous marriage. So, why shouldn't the Aztec Children do the same? In a grotesque spectacle, Máximo was dressed in an evening suit, Bartola in a satin gown, and the two were paraded before a paying audience in a London church. The event was heavily advertised, hyped as a bizarre cultural ritual rather than the exploitative farce it truly was. There's even a photograph from that day, capturing the moment, but what it doesn't show is what the siblings were thinking or feeling during this shameless act. There is just as big a mystery surrounding the later life of the Aztec Children as there is about their origins and how they ended up in America. It was reported in the early winter of 1867 that Máximo had died while they were touring in South Carolina. Many accounts written up until quite recently suggested that this was the case, and reiterated the story. It doesn't seem to have been the case though. Instead, other evidence suggests the pair lived down to around 1901. Well, a postcard from a show in Germany at that time appears to show them in old age. If it was them, their careers were unusually long. Unlike a lot of the individuals involved in the freak shows of the day, the Aztec Children were not capable of taking advantage of their fame to make money and then retire. Instead, they remained guardians of those who profited from them. In all likelihood, they just largely disappeared from the record as they were rebranded. They could, after all, no longer be described as the Aztec Children once they were fully grown. Part of the reason they disappeared from the public eye to some extent was also because new alleged Aztec Children emerged to take their place. There were numerous circuses touring in the late 1800s with exhibits like The Last of the Aztecs and The Aztec Sisters, and this carried on even into the 20th century. The 1932 cult classic Freaks, set in a French touring circus, even featured an act eerily similar to the Aztec Children, a nod to the kinds of performances that had fascinated and disturbed audiences for decades. Máximo and Bartola weren't just a one-off curiosity. They were part of a wider trend in 19th century popular culture where disability, difference, and myth were commodified for mass entertainment. But in their case, it was particularly exploitative, a deeply troubling example of how far someone would go to profit from fabricated stories and vulnerable lives. It's a type of exploitation that would be unthinkable and of course illegal by today's standards. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Máximo and Bartola, the Aztec Children. I hope you found their story interesting. Let me know what you thought of the lives down below in the comments. And if you want more videos like this, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.